us as a country. That clearly we're living longer, right? That's a statistical fact. But is length of life the best measure all of the time? No, why not? What could we be missing?
Quality of it?
Quality of life. How do you determine quality of life?
How you live?
How you live, and who decides how you live?
You do.
You do, based on
What you do.
right, what you're able to do, based on that whole idea of health and goals and being able to do the things, for our body being able to do what our mind requires it to do. And I think it's a bad day when it's no longer able to do that. So it's trying to wrap our minds around these different ideas and dimensions of health and how we can assign a value to how well we're doing. But it's really clear when we look at infant mortality, when we look at how long people are living, that this century is so much better than the one prior to it in the form of decades. However, a lot of those advances that we're getting in the form of age is because of the treatment-based approach of medicine. People are much less susceptible to disease and illness and infirmity because of things like medical science advances, prescription drugs, vaccines. The things that were destroying people in the past aren't really doing that. But our current focus is more on these modifiable risk factors and the four things that are killing us the most often and the fastest rate. And what are those? Josh? Heart disease? How are we getting heart disease? Cha-cha? Yes, smoking. What else? Poor nutrition. What else? Not enough exercise. And alcohol consumption. So those things that are modifiable risk factors that we are looking at, that although there is in our genetic predispositions to those, and things that we cannot modify, like who gave birth to us, how old we are, how deep things run in our families, that's a big part of our quality of life and our capability. We can't modify those, but they also play a smaller role in some of the things that we can modify. And these are the biggest topics of this entire class, relating to the four aspects that you just mentioned. So in general, we'll talk about some genetic predispositions today. We'll talk about psychiatric disorders, some neuronal basis to how all of these things affect us. It's much more complicated than just a conscious choice and saying, hey, if you're a smoker, why don't you just stop smoking? Well, I bet you that most of them would, but sometimes the effects are overpowering. And the same thing is with drinking as well. So it's more complicated. It's trying to identify how and why some of these things happen, but also how to make a positive impact on that. We got through physical activity in which people are doing an extremely poor job as a general population of acquiring in the form of 30 minutes a day, 5 times a week. And that's not even accounting for any sort of type of exercise or things like volume or intensity or how hard things is. We're not talking about the stuff that you're doing right now. We're training for sport performance. We're just talking about increasing quality of life. And those are two very different things. Training is akin to a dose-response relationship in the sense that the bigger the dose, the more response. I mean, there's a lot of things in life where that's not the case, that more is not always better. And I'm sure you can think of some of those examples. That's a very slippery slope. Philosophically, a slippery slope is something that happens and you do something and it causes a lot of unforeseen consequences that you did not predict. So a lot of things, and hopefully those ideas are circulating in your head, that more is not always better. However, the human body is very capable from a physical capacity standpoint, and with exercise, oftentimes more is better. There is a point of diminishing returns, but I guarantee you most people are not even close to sniffing what that actually is. That a lot of people are worried about the whole concept of overtraining and doing too much. We need to focus on the concept of undertraining, and people are not doing nearly enough. And would you rather be someone that kind of found out what the limit was and dialed it back a little bit, or someone that never even knew what the heck that limit even was because you never approached it? So that's the difference between training for sport performance and training for just increasing quality of life, but they're not really mutually exclusive. So it's what kind of thought are we putting into the activity that we're doing and what we're putting into our body, because the things that we are eating are not helping us either. And a lot of that has to do with the preparation that we have and also the education that we have behind it too. That we spend a lot of time talking about this last class period, that the jam or the pickle that people get into is people oftentimes don't eat until they find out that it's too late and you really need to eat. And that's a biological urge that's overwhelming sometimes too. And we make poor choices because of the expediency or the time or the location, or usually all three of those. But unfortunately, the way that the food industry works is they don't usually provide the healthiest and most effective options in the least amount of time in the most locations that are most pertinent to you, especially around here. They certainly don't. If you lived in places that we talked about before, there's a lot of pockets in the country, but West Coast being one of them, Colorado being one of them, a lot of places on the East Coast being some of them, that it's more incorporated into daily life. But in the Midwest, I grew up in the Midwest, and it's nothing against Midwest people that lived in the South for a long time. There's nothing against people that live in the South, but from a culture standpoint, it's not really as embedded in society. Maybe you guys have seen that based on where you come from. That a lot of places in the country, it's actually really cool to get outside and exercise a lot and take care of the things that you're putting into your body. In a lot of places, it's not, and people aren't too worried about it. And then look at where you actually grew up, and look at what your parents taught you, and I guarantee you probably think it's very, very similar, if not exactly the same, until we get older and have the opportunity to make some of our own choices. Those are two of the four, and today we will get into the other two. One of those being tobacco use. And when we say tobacco use, at this point in time, we mean smoking, not nicotine. We talked about nicotine actually being a very useful substance, and that's what people are addicted to. The nicotine that is in the tobacco. It has effects on the sympathetic nervous system, it has effects on the parasympathetic nervous system. It's one of the only drugs that does that. So it has a very fight or flight response, and it also has a rest and digest response too. So it increases things like focus, memory, learning, cognition, fine motor skills, kinesthetic awareness. Nicotine is extremely desirable. At one point, it was so desirable that governing bodies who were doing drug testing for different sports, the World Anti-Doping Agency, so basically the king of international doping control, when they were doing all of these drug tests for performance-enhancing drugs, nicotine was coming up in the overwhelming majority of tests that were showing up in athletes' urine. Most popular sports being football, hockey, and baseball. But also other sports as well. And they're saying, oh my gosh, why is there so much nicotine in everybody's system? And if there is, maybe there has to be some merit to it of why everybody's using it. They're not smoking. Your generation, and the generation, I guess we'd be in the same one, it spans about 35 years-ish, a little bit higher if you're a male, a little bit lower if you're a female, but every 36 years or so we get a new generation kicking in, and this generation is very different than the one prior to it with smoking. I mean, what do you guys know about smoking and some of the negative effects that it has on health? Does anyone really embark on going out of their way on purpose to smoke cigarettes because it's healthy for you? Absolutely not. But people really didn't know that for a long time. It wasn't until people were dying at a significant rate until smoking was apparent that it was really terrible for us as well. So we don't seem to be smoking as much anymore. And going back to the example before is athletes specifically are using smokeless tobacco, they're using nicotine lozenges and nicotine patches. So almost the same things that people are using to curb withdrawal symptoms from smoking that a lot of athletes are using to increase sport performance for some of those things. It's actually really interesting. The nicotine is phenomenal for us. But we haven't figured out a delivery system that's actually good, and that's what's really bad, is in the form of tobacco. Smoke seems to be extremely detrimental, that it's killing almost 500,000 people per year in the United States, a significant amount of people. I mean, it's taking on average about 10 years off of an individual's life. And when I say that it is more than HIV, illegal drug use, alcohol use, motor vehicle injuries, and firearm injuries per year, that's combined. That's not just each and every single one of those. That's adding every single one of those up combined. So when we say that it's a modifiable risk factor, there's certainly an addictive component to it, but it is a choice at some point in time to do it or not do it. But once somebody does, some of those properties take hold physiologically and neurologically that make it extremely addictive and hard to stop. When you look at the organs that are just disintegrating and being extremely negatively affected, especially those that are related to the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. So think of the cardiovascular system as the heart, the blood, and the blood vessels, and think of the respiratory system as the lungs. Everything that's responsible for either breathing in air and then breathing that out. And if those organs and tissues become damaged and scarred and hardened, and it becomes more difficult to not only consume oxygen, but transport that in the bloodstream because of the stress that our heart is under, because of the arteries that may be narrowed and working a little bit harder, it increases our blood pressure, and over time we get a cardiovascular system that's working too hard and too long, and things in our body don't like to be working too hard and too long. Because if they do, they don't work very well. And that's where heart disease, in large part, comes from. But it is the organs of the cardiovascular system and respiratory system that are by far and away affected the most out of those. But when you look at the use and how the idea and aspect of dependence actually progresses, the rate of dependence usually takes about 23 months. There are some differences, but the addictive components of the nicotine isn't typically a one-time deal for a lot of people. That it takes multiple times, using it often, over months, and that's where dependence starts to kick in. And we start to see physiological changes in the body. That if you've never smoked a cigarette in your life, or if you've never used nicotine, maybe you've never used smokeless tobacco either, and all of a sudden you try it, what's the typical response that most people have? What's the response? What does it make them feel like? The first time? Bad? Yeah. Sometimes. When bad in what way? Dizzy, kind of buzzed the first time. People throw up oftentimes the very first time. Nothing really appealing about it, right? And that's not always the case. Especially with smokeless tobacco too, because the dose of nicotine is so much higher in smokeless tobacco than it is in the form of cigarettes. It's actually a little bit quicker in cigarettes because it's closer to the blood-brain barrier, and inhaling that actually gets, within 30 seconds or so, nicotine through the blood-brain barrier, but there's more fluctuations in nicotine levels in the bloodstream, whereas with smokeless tobacco, because the content of nicotine is so much higher, it does last a little bit longer, but you also get bigger curves as well. So over time, people start to continue using, and then it spins onto something which they do feel good, and we'll explain why in a little bit, that it actually does make them feel good. And once the nicotine levels in the blood start to get close to zero again, very similar with alcohol, what happens? The urge to use it is there again, and then the cycle. That's a really, really vicious cycle in terms of addiction, and that's how it works with most drugs, those that are legal and those that are not illegal. It actually shows to be a little bit higher in white individuals and women, especially as far as dependent goes, but it's inversely related to how much money you make and how much school that you actually receive formally. So it seems like the less education and the less money that you have, the more progressive the dependence is on nicotine. But it's actually the exact opposite with alcohol. It's kind of weird when you think about it like that. Whereas the more money and the more education you have, the less people typically are using tobacco. But there's a lot of people that are vulnerable. Genetics plays a tremendous role in that, and so does our environmental factors. That when we look at the genetic influence, the dependence of nicotine is polygenic in the form that it involves multiple chromosomes. On a biological level, genetics predicts almost half of the risk variance of people that are addicted to nicotine. About half of the people that will try it have a disposition to become addicted, where the other half do not. It's crazy when you think about biology and how some of that stuff works. But what it really boils down to is not the nicotine itself, it is actually dopamine and serotonin and the level of sensitivity and the density of the neurons, of both of those neurons. They are neurotransmitters in the brain. And the higher levels of density that we actually have of those, the less predictor of addiction exists. But the lower density that we have, those hormones that make us, they're not hormones, they're neurotransmitters that make us feel really good and have that reward balance of the things that we engage in and make us feel good. And that's exactly why people smoke cigarettes or use nicotine in the first place. The lower density of those neurotransmitters is a much higher correlation with addiction, because individuals with low density of those neurotransmitters need sometimes an external stimulus that actually manipulates the amount of dopamine and serotonin. So again, it's not just telling people to say, hey, let's stop doing this. Maybe you can't really change some of those things as far as dopamine and serotonin go. So a lot of it boils down to impulsivity. A lot of it has to do with psychiatric disorders in terms of antisocial personality disorder, anxiety, depression, all of those things that have typically lower levels of dopamine and serotonin that exist in people's brains that lead to higher levels and risks of addiction. So they're used, sometimes they're in the form of self-medication. And that's what the case of narcotics too, that there is such thing as an addictive personality, and that's why it's not really the personality, it's the biology of someone that makes people become addicted to things to make them feel good, because they may not have the same levels of neurotransmitters of somebody else that doesn't need the same effect. So it's really interesting when you think about it from that regard. But people will use nicotine, just like they will use alcohol, to self-medicate a lot of times and regulate how good they feel through some of those substances that you can abuse. When we get to alcohol, it's a little bit different, you know what I mean? Think about smoking. If somebody wants to smoke, and you're at a party, you're at a college party, if you've been to one before, and somebody wants to smoke, what do they usually have to do? Either not do it or go outside, right? It's really kind of disrespectful. I mean, it affects a lot of other people. The secondhand smoke is a very, very big deal. It's not a made-up phenomenon. So you have to go outside. It's kind of a pass. It's not really socially acceptable, is it? To sit there and smoke right in front of people? Which is much more socially acceptable. I'm being serious. Is it or is it not? All right, so if somebody was smoking weed at a party, would everybody be looking at them like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Whether you were doing it or not, is it pretty socially acceptable? Absolutely. It's much more socially acceptable than smoking cigarettes is. It really is. And you have to look at the acceptability socially and how we define some of those norms and the usage of those as well. But alcohol is extremely socially acceptable. People typically don't, it's possible, a lot of people don't really have parties without alcohol present, do they?
No.
That's how socially acceptable it is. That's the expectation. And that's what lends itself to the use and oftentimes abuse of things that are extremely, well, can be devastating to us as well. When we do get to some behavior change theories a little bit later, we'll touch on this more, but please bear with me in the sense that none of the stuff that we talk about is an appeal to fear. That's the worst form of education, when people try to scare you into not doing something. No one never try to scare you into not doing something. It's more educating about the pros and the cons and how that fits into the lifestyle that you actually want to lead. Does it match up with the goals that you have? Does it match up with these levels of health that you actually assign to yourself? But that's the worst form of education. It never sticks with people when they try to scare you into not doing something. So from this point forward, when we talk about things like alcohol and nicotine and physical activity and nutrition, don't get scared, just learn and synthesize it and take it into consideration so that we can use that in a positive way when we go forward. But alcohol is extremely difficult to understand of how and why it actually affects us differently. And it very much affects us differently. Maybe, especially when you look at alcoholism, that maybe you know somebody, or you are somebody, that you can go out and have a drink or two and have a good time and socialize and be safe, find your way back home and get your own bed and all is well. But maybe you know someone that, or you are someone that you can't do that. That when someone takes a drink of alcohol, the urge is, man, it's not their fault. It's biological in nature. And heavily relates to our genetics, as does all form of biology. It's kind of a rhetorical point. But if you know someone or are someone that takes a drink of alcohol, and the first thing on your mind is, I need another drink of alcohol, it's too overwhelming. Like, it's almost not possible to just be reasonable, because it affects people differently, affects everybody differently, and the relationship that you have with it, something that you all really, really need to figure out, for better or for worse. But if you are someone or know someone that, if you do consume alcohol and then all of a sudden you get really excited and you need another one, and you need another one because it makes you feel really good, you got to be careful and you got to watch out. I mean, you really got to watch out. Sometimes you got to get out of the way, because that stuff can be really damaging. Where someone else can say, well, why are you like that? Why are you doing that? I could easily just go have a drink or two or three and be completely fine. It's like, no, I don't really. But some people can't do that, and that's exactly how the neuronal basis, or the way that the nervous system works, the way our genetics work. Almost more than nicotine, the psychological factors play a big role in the consumption of alcohol as they relate to the environment. Remember some of those studies that we talked about before, in the sense that genetics is a big predictor, but environment is a big predictor as well. That just because you are an alcoholic by virtue of genetics or susceptible to being addicted to alcohol, if you're in an environment in which you don't consume any alcohol, you're not really at risk. Is everybody with me on that? But if you are at risk, and then you're in an environment where it's extremely acceptable, not only just drinking casually or socially, but extremely heavily, which in this country is much different than other countries. And Chacha even talked about that last week in class, that you look at countries that are European or even Mediterranean in nature, where alcohol is much more embedded into the culture at an early age, and the frequency of the consumption of alcohol is higher, but the volume tends to be much lower. And the idea of the French paradox, in which we drink a lot of alcohol, right? And it's damaging, but people in France drink a lot of alcohol, but they live healthier lifestyles, oftentimes live longer. And that's the French paradox. And that's where people start to think that wine and alcohol is really good for you. And can it be? Of course it can be. There's a lot of research that shows that low and moderate levels of alcohol consumption are good. But there's a fine line between moderate and binge drinking. There's not that gap or buffer of 4 or 5 drinks we can just kind of play with and figure it out on our own. It's usually about 1 or 2 that does that. So sometimes you got to look to the cultural expectations. You have to look to society. And in this country, it's really not a big deal to, especially when we're younger, to get extremely drunk, do some regrettable things, and shake it off the next morning with a terrible hangover. And You got your friends that are just kind of picking you up and you do the same thing. Seriously, all over again. Next weekend and next weekend. And I'm not trying to sound facetious or funny, but it's true that oftentimes we don't take it very seriously in terms of the effect it can have on us because it has been shown to be healthy, but not healthy enough that if you don't drink that you should start drinking. But don't be scared if you do drink. If we keep it low and you keep it moderate, and the frequency is also low-ish, can lead to a part of an extremely healthy lifestyle. But you got to figure that out and how it actually works for you. But we go back centuries ago in the Greco-Roman world that wine was actually considered to be really, really healthy for us. And it was a remedy for a lot of health problems because when you go back to the Greco-Roman world about 2,000 years before the Common Era, what did not exist at that time from a sanitation standpoint? Water, aqueducts, and water treatment plants and facilities and things. So when there was fermented liquids, I mean, has anyone ever heard of mead? Honey wine? Yeah, one of, if not the first form of alcohol to be discovered, in which people are walking through the woods and a beehive got turned over into a portion of water. People started to drink the water, and after the honey had fermented in there for a really long time, developed some decent alcohol content, pretty similar to wine, and found out that people that were drinking alcoholic beverages through fermented grapes in the form of red wine, or the fermented skin of those grapes in white wine, or the honey wine, that it was very sanitary. The alcohol, it was the most sanitary liquid that you could drink, and it wasn't nasty water where there was no plumbing and there were no sewer systems and there were no treatment plants. That water was killing people too, right? But the alcohol was actually keeping people healthier. And there's a lot of philosophers, some of the leading philosophical influences in the Western world, are just praising how good the alcohol and wine was for us. But what do we see in this country? Much longer, but more recent to where we're at now. You know, we hit the 19th century and the temperance movement rolls around because people were finding out that as alcohol levels increased, what else also increased? Unemployment was a big one. Spousal abuse was a big one. Neglecting the family, a huge one. Alcoholism was just flat out ruining people's lives in the 19th century. There was an entire movement about not just the reduction of alcohol, but the complete abstention of alcohol in general. Almost like, hey, we're not doing this very well in the United States. We're just not drinking it appropriately in the right amounts and at the right time. So the only idea was to not drink. But how did that work, really, with prohibition? Not really well, right? People were making their own moonshine, got black markets for all that kind of stuff. It didn't work very well, and it still doesn't actually work very well. The prevalence of alcohol use is extremely high in this country, but you look at 1 in 6 adults currently in the United States reported binge drinking. Currently, how do we define binge drinking? And you're saying, wait a minute, that's not that high, 1 in 6? Well, how do we define binge drinking? Yes. So not just doing that, but doing that 4 times in the same month. And then not just the 2 to 3 for women and the 3 to 4 for men. Doing that 8 drinks per binge 4 times per month. 1 in 6 people are doing that. Is that pretty representative of a typical, I don't want to say typical college student. Not making fun of college students. I was one. I love college and students in college. I loved it so much I never left college. It's the only thing I've known since I was 18. Either went to one or stayed at one. So yeah, trust me, it's not lost on me. I feel like I've had, as I've gotten older too, I have a hard time communicating with people that are outside of the college age. I'm just so used to communicating with 18 to 22-year-olds that people that are older or younger, it's just weird. I need to work on that and get out there a little bit. Think about that. How typical is that in college? 8 drinks 4 times a month. To say that it's the norm may be high, but is that happening? Yeah, that is happening. It's most common in 18 to 34 years of age. So, I mean, why do you think that between 18 and 34 years old that drinking is most heavy and most prevalent? And why is it higher in men as well? Twice as high in men. Yeah, men are more predisposed to impulsive behavior, absolutely. They're typically more influenced by cultures and peers and societies as well. But why that 18 to 34 years of age? Even if there's an opinion, why do you think between 18 and 34?
Maybe this is prime. Then after that,
Yeah, kind of a combination of both. That the negative effects aren't as severe under that old bit. Man, I mean, hopefully got figured out by the time you get to the 30s, but they, especially, no one had me for substance abuse in here, but when you get into the 30s and 40s and later, these effects are extremely damaging. That, I mean, when you're in your late teens, early 20s, and you kind of got time. You have the physical capacity and wherewithal that hangovers are not nearly as severe when you're younger. They are not. There's a biological reason for that in the sense that...
That's a lie. No.
Yeah. Yes.
I can't drink no more. I had alcohol poisoning like 2 weeks ago. So like, I'm done.
It's there's a dose response relationship to alcohol and the consumption of it, absolutely.
I'm gonna stick to water.
That's a good thing to do. Honestly, I won't fight you. I won't fight you on that. But seriously, bear with me. It's not really a laughing matter. It's happened to a lot of us, or made some decisions that weren't the best ones. And sometimes it's not about not dwelling on that and letting that ruin your life, but also using that from an experiential standpoint to make positive adjustments. And remember that experiential application of our practical knowledge is what wisdom is. That sometimes you can't really become a wise person unless you've had the experience, and you know to not do something a second time if you did it a first time. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a second time. So sometimes we don't beat ourselves up for things that are not the most positive things that we've ever done. But physiologically and biologically, hangovers and the effects that alcohol does, they manifest much worse as we get older. And there is a reason for that, because when we drink alcohol, the liver is the filter for that liquid in our body. And in the form of ethanol, as alcohol actually gets broken down to in the liver, it gets converted into acetaldehyde, and then it gets transformed into acetate and then excreted in the urine. But we have an enzyme in the liver that's called glutathione that we have more of when we were younger and less of when we were older. And that enzyme is actually used in the metabolism of the acetaldehyde and breaking that down a little bit easier. And the reason that you should care so much about the acetaldehyde is it's about 10 to 30 times more toxic than the alcohol itself. And that's what makes you feel like absolute garbage, is when you don't have enough glutathione to attach on and help metabolize the acetaldehyde and turn it into acetate. So you get much less of that as you get older, and you do have more of that as you're younger too. But also life circumstances are different when we are younger as well. Maybe you get banged up on a Saturday night and you can rest all day Sunday. Is it that big of a deal? Maybe over weeks and months, if it's stopping you from going to the library, if it's stopping you from hanging out with friends, if it's stopping you from doing physical activity or engaging in the things that you actually like to do, that could be bad. But it's really not that big of a deal compared to someone that, and if you know someone that has kids, they're waking up at the same time. It doesn't matter what you did the night before. And you need to plan accordingly to make sure that you can match what they do with the same amount of energy. And people find out really quick what some of the repercussions are when you have other responsibilities to do. And they just seem to be less between those years of the decade of the 20s. So there's more leeway and there's more room. There's more people that are less settled in terms of family situations, settled in life circumstances, and you find yourself surrounded by people that are more similar in nature and willing to engage in those behaviors. So it's not it's not something that is necessarily different to people that are younger, but the environment changes as we age, and people's choices change, and their lot in life changes as well. And none of it has to do with any of our physiology. It just has to do with the people that we surround ourselves with. And people are not bad people. People that do bad things are not bad people either. There's a difference, I think, between being a bad person and making a bad decision. Don't equate someone that drinks alcohol or doesn't engage in physical activity or doesn't eat well or smokes that is a bad. It has nothing to do with people being good, bad, or otherwise. It is how it affects your health. And that's the whole point of this class, is the education and the promotion of that. So don't be self-righteous. Don't think that you're better than anybody else because you exercise more, you train harder, eat better, don't drink or whatever. That's not the point of any of these things. It's the education that goes behind all of those factors. And you make the choice whether you want to do them or not. Go ahead, be my guest. I will not stop you. I think that autonomy and individualism and freedom of choice are all really important qualities. Be my guest. Just be aware that maybe you know, and we know a little bit more than we did as well. But eventually, we have to assign how healthy we are based on the things that we want to do in life. And hopefully that's our new definition of health. And if we're waking up distraught and unable to engage in the things that you actually want to do, or maybe you have plans and you didn't do them. Maybe you're going to go work out, didn't do them. Maybe you're going to study, didn't do it. Maybe you had to do something with your friends, didn't do it. Maybe you're going to do something with your kids, couldn't do it. That's a big time problem if something like that happens. Especially people that are in relationships, they don't take too kindly to that either. Some of those responsibilities aren't shared mutually across the board, and someone has to sit on the sidelines because they're not feeling too well. So assign how well we're feeling with what we're actually doing, and that's the whole point of this topic of alcohol is, hey, if you're drinking it and you're consuming it, let's just do it in a way that it lends itself to actually maybe a better life, a better social life. I think it's awesome to go out and hang out with friends and have a good time and engage in good conversation and do things that are fun. That's a big aspect of life. But if we're doing it in a way that actually facilitates things that become even better as a result, that's where we need to get to. Not because I did this, it's actually making other things worse. That's the disconnect between healthy and unhealthy. So make the choice for yourself. Make a good one. But just be weary of how some of those things are happening. Unfortunately, sometimes we have things that decisions that we make that we'd like to go back and do a little bit differently. And let's say you are trying to curb or change the amount of alcohol that you're consuming and doing. If you do slip, it's okay. Just the thought of trying to make some improvements in any walk or any aspect of life is positive progress. That can have really negative effects on us too. If we have goals that are unrealistic, unattainable, that don't fit with our lifestyles, and then we constantly just demand so much for ourselves and we beat ourselves up for making a really bad choice, that's equally as unhealthy. So leave some room for this idea of humanism and making errors and making mistakes and growing with them, but just be really careful of what some of those effects happen to be in the form of alcohol. There are times and places in which there's risks associated with the alcohol, and there's some that are not. And another big part of your health is being in environments that are conducive to fostering and developing your health, not those that are risky. That with especially high levels of alcohol consumption, the risk of injuries goes through the roof. Violence goes, it's insanely high statistically compared to no alcohol involved. And then the risk of sexual behaviors, risky sexual behaviors, goes up as well. And the thing about alcohol and the way that it inhibits decision making, it doesn't actually make you immune to the consequences. People fully understand the consequences, they just don't care. That's exactly how it affects the brain and the body. That you do know, but you don't care what is actually going to happen. I was talking to Jason Rainmaker about something the other day, the dean of students, and I was just saying to him, I was like, I can't even imagine the stuff that you see and do all the time. I mean, that would be a hard job. I couldn't do something like that. And he said, to be honest with you, he's like, if there was no alcohol, he said he couldn't even imagine, I don't think he would mind sharing this, a bad case of sexual abuse, of violence, fighting, I don't mean little scuffles, but severe fights that didn't involve alcohol. It's like in 10 years, he's like, I think every single one of them has actually involved alcohol. And if you RAs in here, work in dorms, live in dorms, I mean, how much stuff involved alcohol? Would you say near 100%? Near? Yeah, it's ridiculous. The things that, just be careful that you are a product of the choices and the decisions that you actually make. There's immediate risks and there's long-term risks here, but those long-term risks seem to manifest themselves through the 20s and through the 30s and into the 40s as far as real physiological deficiencies affecting cells and tissues and organ systems and causing things like cirrhosis and stroke and heart disease and high blood pressure, liver disease, cancer, memory problems, social problems, that those aren't as risky when we're younger. But remember that dose response. If you continue the negative habits through the 20s, through the 30s, into the 40s, you're starting to put 2 decades on that stuff now. It's a little bit different than just having a good time in college. That's a big difference when you're talking about 20 years. So just be wary of what some of those effects can have, that if you're not, there's oftentimes consequences to the things that we're doing, and unfortunately we don't get to choose them. And a lot of times alcohol is used as, maybe not so much anymore, but what had been in the past, an excuse for the decisions that we make. That people generally don't make the best decisions with high alcohol consumption. But it has environmental factors too, you know what I mean? There's a big difference in going to, than having a few drinks with your friends in a low-key environment and just hanging out and having a good time, or being at a place that could be really bad for your health in other ways too, you know what I mean? Could be the amount of people there, it could be your physical health, your emotional health, just not lending yourself to an environment that's you growing as a person. Sometimes it actually has nothing to do with the alcohol itself. It really doesn't. It's about the environment, and it's about the things that you want to do in the environment. But it does end up being a conscious choice. We'll end up on this one today, but right before that, we look at this model of alcohol and the doses that make up standard drinks, that they're not very high whatsoever. Sometimes the easiest way to measure and to count the amount of consumption of alcohol we have is through beer, or through a container that you can actually count how many beers you actually have, right? But what happens if you're drinking wine that doesn't come in a container? I guess you could buy this little airtight bottle things of wine, but let's say you're drinking a bottle of wine where, what's the problem? Yeah, it's really hard to actually figure out the size, correct? What do you do to stop filling up when there's no room? Maybe some of you, when it starts overflowing, you stop? Think about that. How do you know? Maybe you actually had three drinks in that one glass. And you thought you had 3, but you really had 9. Hard alcohol is the worst. It really is. When you talk about, if you're having to drink you're talking about 1.5 fluid ounces, the proof is double the percentage of alcohol. So if you're looking at 80 proof and 40% alcohol, there's things that are 150 proof There's things that are 100 proof. That's not one drink anymore. That stuff will make your nose bleed when you wake up, and you wake up and your pillow is full of blood. Yeah, and stuff that you drank that was only meant to be cooking with. Don't be messing around with those kinds of things. Does anyone, if you're at a party, and again, there's other circumstances that are outside of college, but this is just more pertinent to you right now. Is anyone really trying to measure out 1.5 fluid ounces? Or what do they do? Seriously, I'm not really making light. I'm just trying to show the differences and how fast you can accumulate 10, 12 drinks no problem when you think that you had, yeah. If you fill up your mouth with something 12 times, it doesn't mean 12 drinks. If someone pours something in your mouth, that is not, unless you measured out 1.5 fluid ounces, that's not the same. If you're pouring something into a mug, that's not the same. I'm not saying that you have to be so obsessive that you're carrying around a measuring cup, okay? I want you to do things that are also socially acceptable in the real world and applicable. But keep in mind, just because something is in a container of something, it doesn't mean that it's one of something. And if you want to get a good grasp on the amount of alcohol you're consuming, you just have to know what and how much you actually are consuming. And the type and the proof is dependent upon the actual size. So typically you'll find beer around, depends on what kind of beer that you are drinking, but North American mass-produced swill beer, Budweiser, Bud Light, Miller Lite, Coors Light, probably 4.5% or 4.5% alcohol. I mean, you could go to Paddle or Tap downtown. There's different forms of craft beer that can be 10, 12% alcohol. Seriously. Wine, probably around 15%-ish, 12 to 15. Alcohol, hard alcohol, could typically around 80 proof. So they're very different in that regard. But as we put it all back together, what are we really dealing with? Leading cause of death in the United States in 2011, heart disease, cancer, lower respiratory disease, and stroke. But what are the actual causes of death on the far right in that same year? Tobacco, poor diet, poor physical inactivity. So the 4 leading causes of death are what they are because of the things that we are smoking, drinking, not exercising, and then combine them all together. So if we can get a grip on 4 of those, we can be doing pretty good. And we're going to continue on with some of those measures in subsequent classes. So we'll start to change gears again next class when we come in.